It's 1982, and Tony James hasn't heard from the lead singer of his band for over a year. Tony spent 6 years of his life giving everything he had to that band, and it almost worked. They made several albums, 2 of them even charted, but they never became as big as they could have been. Tony hadn't heard from that singer since the manager that Tony hired to save his band took the singer that Tony basically created to America to launch his solo career. But that day, Tony got a call. The singer was back in town and he wanted Tony to hear something. So they met up, and Billy Idol played Tony White Wedding. Tony thought it was amazing, and it left him dreaming about what could have been and wondering where it all went wrong. This is the story of Generation X. Like this video if you liked it, and consider subscribing if you want to come along with me as I'm trying to learn more about music history. I also have memberships open if you really want to support what I do here and join in with me as I'm trying to learn more music history. You can click the link in the description below to figure out how to do that. You'll get early access to videos, your name in the video. If we get more members, I can start doing polls, and I take your suggestions more seriously when I'm considering what videos to do next. So if any of that sounds interesting or worth it to you, click the link in the description below. Tony James was born in a suburb of London in 1953. His family moved around the London area quite a bit, but by the time he was in school, they were settled in Twickenham. When he was around 11, he was doing what all the kids were doing and listening to records from people like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. But then he started to check out some albums from heavier groups like Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin. He had just bought Black Sabbath's first album when a friend said they were playing a small club called Eel Pie Island nearby, so they went to see the show. He remembered, "I went to see them and I was so blown away because I had obviously never seen a live group before ever. It was the loudest thing I'd ever heard in my life. It was incredible. You felt that you were a part of something really exciting." Ajax, you want to say hi? You heard me talking and had to wake up. So naturally, he and his friends decided to get in on the fun and start a band. One friend already owned a guitar and played guitar. Another friend already had a drum set, so he decided he would play bass. But you okay? But he couldn't afford to buy one, so he just decided to make one out of Perspex. Funny enough, he gave that bass to Paul, who learned to play on it before joining the band The Clash. He went to a show for a group called Heavy Metal Kids where he met a guy named Mick Jones, and according to Mick, quote, "We had the same feathered haircut." End quote. That's kind of how they met. But there is another story that Kelvin Blacklock, who was a singer that would be in a band with them, introduced them. Tony told a version of that story saying that he was looking for people who loved the New York Dolls, and that Tony really wanted to make a band like them when he met Kelvin. Kelvin said that he was already in a band and he invited Tony to see them rehearse. When Tony turned up, they were in the process of firing Mick as their guitarist, so the two of them left together and became great friends. They realized that they had a lot more in common than just their haircuts. Mick was already in a band that was originally called The Delinquents, but would eventually become London SS. The band had a ton of lineup changes and never really got going, but a lot of the members of that band would go on to form The Clash. There were some members of London SS who claimed that Tony completely changed his style and his aesthetic whenever he met Mick. They said that when he first came around, he was really into that heavy metal, Blue Oyster Cult type of look, but after meeting Mick and becoming friends with Mick, he turned completely punk. Eventually, Tony was brought into London SS, but by January of 1976, after several more lineup changes, the group was basically just Mick and Tony, so they decided to end it. Mick quickly got with some of the past members of that group and formed The Clash, while Tony got a real job for at least a little bit because he had graduated with a computer science degree. He always had that to fall back on. In August of 1976, Gene October placed an ad in Melody Maker about a new band that he wanted to start. Apparently, it was being started by the guys behind Acme Attractions, which was a clothing store set up to rival Malcolm McLaren's store, which was first called Let It Rock and then changed to Sex. Malcolm had the Sex Pistols as his band that he was managing, so the Acme Attractions people wanted their own band, and they wanted Gene to lead it. John Tao, who was working in a music shop at the time, answered the ad and got into the band playing drums. William Broad also auditioned and got the spot of guitarist. William knew Tony already, so he suggested Tony to Gene, and Tony became the bassist. This band called themselves Chelsea and debuted on October 18th, supporting Throbbing Gristle. But it was quickly obvious that Gene didn't like his backing band. He didn't think they were good enough, so they split. But the three guys in the backing band, William Broad, John Tao, and Tony James, enjoyed playing together so much that they just formed their own band. But they also kind of agreed with Gene, at least about William Broad, that he wasn't the best guitarist. They thought he would make a much better frontman. He had the energy and the passion and, frankly, the look for it. So He took off his guitar, adopted the stage name Billy Idol, and became the group's frontman. William Broad was born in 1955 in Stanmore. When he was 2, his father, who was a World War veteran and a salesman, moved the family to Long Island, New York. He said he never remembered being in England before moving, but he was always very aware that he was not American, and he always refused to say the Pledge of Allegiance with the rest of his class, which is a really weird thing they make us do in American schools. I don't know if that happens in the UK. I don't even know if the UK has a Pledge of Allegiance, but growing up in American schools, they make you recite the Pledge of Allegiance in class, and it's really strange. Hopefully, they don't do it anymore. I don't know. They moved back to England 4 years later with a new daughter who was named Jane. Billy seemed to have a decent relationship with his parents, at least until he was a teenager, saying about his mom, "My sister Jane and I were lucky to have such a lovely mom who was both caring and compassionate." His mother was a devout Christian, and Billy's first memory of being in front of a crowd was reading the Bible in front of the church congregation. By the time he was 7, he was learning how to play the drums, but then he realized that Paul McCartney and John Lennon were out in front of the band, like kind of front stage in front of everybody. He thought that was more interesting, so he bought himself a guitar just to have something to sing along to. A friend gave him copies of Rave magazine, and by around 14 years old, he started growing his hair out and getting really into the rock scene, which led his father to not talk to him for 2 years. But he says he understands where his parents were coming from. They came from a different world, a world of war rations and raid warnings. He said, "My parents were always going on about getting qualifications, but there's no qualifications in rock and roll. It's based on what you can do and how you go about doing it." We looked askance at our parents' world, not realizing what they'd gone through. We were able to dream a lot more. In college, studying English, he started hanging around Malcolm McLaren's sex shop and started going to the Sex Pistols shows. He tried to get some of his college friends to start a band, but none of them were interested in punk, so he became at least a peripheral member of the Bromley contingent, which was the group of people who were always around the Pistols, going to all of the shows, hanging out with all of them. Is just kind of like advanced groupies. So he got plugged in and met a bunch of people who had similar dreams of playing this new music. Eventually, he told his parents he was dropping out of school to play in a punk band. Once he joined that band, Chelsea, it was pretty obvious that the guys in the backing band wanted to play a very different style of music than Gene October wanted to play. Billy said, "We did Chelsea for a few months, but we're always writing songs for me to sing, songs for our age group, young 20s, late teens." Once they left Gene, started their own thing, and Billy became the singer, they knew they needed a new guitarist. So they turned to a guy named Durwood Andrews, who was someone that Billy had met at a show like a week before that. His real name was Robert Andrews, or Bob, and as a kid, his older cousin was a bass player in the music scene and showed him some simple chords on guitar. From there, he dedicated his life to music and motorcycle racing because he found a similar rush in both of them. He said, "At the age of 16, I was faced with the choice of professional speedway or jamming in my room with my mates. I chose music." He played in a couple of bands before he was brought into this new group, and an early review of this new band's set said that Durwood was lured away from a long-haired youth band in order to join this group. His earliest influences were the more blues-centric guitar rock bands, so he wasn't aware of the whole Sex Pistols scene. He said, "I never read the music papers, so had no idea something like punk rock was going on, not until I auditioned for Generation X." By the time Durwood joined, they had like a couple of weeks before they were scheduled to play the opening night of the Roxy. They chose the name Generation X, taken from a book about mod culture in the 60s, and played their first gig in December of 1976 at the London Central School of Art and Design. A few days later, they were one of the first bands to play the legendary Roxy. Durwood said that he was terrified before his first shows with the group since he didn't really know what he was doing and didn't really know this music at all. After that, they started playing a ton anywhere they could in these tiny clubs and hanging out in the punk scene with other like-minded musicians, and Durwood commented that there was really nothing better you could be doing at 17 than playing music that you thought was really great, hanging around with your friends who also wanted to make this exciting new music, thinking that you were really changing the musical world, and playing clubs, getting drunk, like just all the stuff that you want to be doing at 17. In February of 1977, they made their first demo of 5 songs and then turned that into a single that they put out the next month. They were building their style and their sound. Billy Idol said, "Basically, we want to be a rock and roll group and be able to say what we feel. Not overtly political, nor a theater comedy group like The Damned, just an honest rock and roll group which enjoys being on stage playing. He also mentioned that they knew they had to be different. Where a lot of other punk bands were basically trying to be the Sex Pistols or the Clash, they needed to be themselves. That's what he learned from artists like Velvet Underground and David Bowie. They were going to be Generation X, not a slightly different Sex Pistols. After playing farther and farther from home, moving outside of London, including playing their first international show in Paris, opening for the Jam, the group fired John Tao as the drummer. Tony was emerging as the group's leader. He had the ideas for what he wanted the band to sound and look like, and John wasn't fitting that, so they fired him. Tony explained that they didn't see the enthusiasm from John that they wanted out of a drummer. Plus, they wanted a more simple rock drummer than the stuff he was playing. To replace him, they brought in Mark Laff. Mark was in the band Subway Sect that played on the infamous Clash White Riot tour and allegedly was almost the Clash's drummer before he barely missed out on that. Despite kind of lukewarm reception from the press because they didn't fully embrace the punk image and sound, so the press didn't know what to do with them, Generation X were getting some serious attention from record labels. They eventually signed to Chrysalis Records and released their first official single, Your Generation. It was more poppy than the public were used to from a punk band, but it made it to number 36 in the charts, despite Elton John calling it garbage. That got them some major press, appearing on Mark Bolan's short-lived show and getting a spot on Top of the Pops. Billy talked about this little explosion, saying, "We didn't realize what was going to happen. We thought it was going to be a gestation period where we'd latch onto this little scene to get our stuff together. And then it exploded. Next minute, every record company in England wanted their own punk rock group. So you were being offered all these things and playing places like the Marquee." He also said about that time that they appeared on Mark Bolan's show that they didn't have their gear. It was some kind of weird mix-up and the gear was stuck somewhere in transit. So the producer came up to Mark and said, they can't go on, they don't have their stuff. But Mark put his foot down and said, if they don't go on, then I'm not on. So Mark really stood up for them and stuck out his neck for them, and that was something that Billy always really appreciated and respected. But then, as Billy remembers, 2 weeks later, before it aired, he died. So 15 million people watched it, and everybody saw us, which was pretty incredible. A report in Zigzag detailed one of their early shows, saying, "Billy Idol, hair now bright red in vivid contrast to his renowned yellow and more recent black, does the twist and bellows out the words while bass player Tony James, guitarist Bob Andrews, and new demon drummer Mark Laff pump away for all they are worth." They described the goal of the group as making things as simple as possible. Billy explained the ethos was to create and write songs about what was happening to them and their friends and around them. Songs from the traditional rock scene like Stairway to Heaven meant nothing to them, so they wanted to create stuff that actually spoke to the lived experience that they were in and their friends were in. They also were itching to release a record, but there was always something that they weren't happy with in the band. With Mark taking over on drums, they thought they were finally ready. So they released their debut album, Generation X, in early 1978, and it ended up hitting number 29 in the charts. Tony said about making the album, "I always think you should record when you're ready," which is what we did with the album. We took our time. But something wasn't quite working with the band, at least commercially. Part of that was the whole punk explosion dying down and people looking to move on to something new already, even though it was like a couple of years in. But part of that was also the punk public not really jiving with the more pop sensibilities of Generation X, and Generation X completely refusing to take any kind of political stand. So people didn't take them seriously, either as their image as punks or in their messaging. But they didn't waste much time before they got back into the studio, releasing Valley of the Dolls in 1979, and it was a more traditional rock album than punk. It fared similarly to the first, with critics not really getting it. I saw one article say that the rhythm section was fine, but Durwood's guitar playing was too cliched metal, and Billy was completely unconvincing as a singer. Tony puts a lot of that album's failure down to them drifting away from that idea of making songs about what they knew. He was trying too hard to buy into the myth of the rock and roller and stop just writing about what they saw and who they were. It wasn't authentic anymore. He thinks that's why it fell flat with the audience more than the departure from the punk sound. But I read one critic who suggested that part of the reason the album failed was that they didn't release any singles far enough before releasing the album. The public had no songs that they knew from the album to latch onto to make them want to buy the record. One of the singles from that album, King Rocker, did reach number 11, which was huge for them. Around this time, the press started to really lay into them about being an image band and not being real. One critic said they were a raw, young band, strong on image, but weak on delivery, with another saying touring. Instead of going out on the road and building a strong following from the ground up, they stayed at home and licked their wounds. They still had their pictures taken frequently, of course, but it seemed like a weak attempt to build up a mystique that they had hardly deserved. They also dealt with people in the scene hitting out at them, with Joe Strummer kind of famously essentially calling them posers. And frankly, Billy Idol just looked too good to follow in that tradition of punk frontmen. I mean, think about Johnny Rotten. No one's going to be writing love poems about his look and his style, but Billy just kind of looked like a more traditional pop frontman. He had that image, he had that style, which led to him getting a lot of abuse. He adopted this tough guy exterior to try and compensate for that. When one interviewer kind of bristled against Billy's attitude during the interview, Tony explained, Billy's been forced into that role due to innumerable pressures. I mean, he gets hassled so much in the streets. Everyone seems to recognize him and they really hate him. But this Tony and Billy show was getting to be too much for Mark and Durwood. They saw the group that they loved turning into something that they weren't particularly interested in. Derwin said that he left once in 1979 but came back to do a tour of Japan and then left again in 1980 because he saw the leaders of the band going in a direction that he wasn't comfortable with and moving towards a style that he didn't want to do. My hunch was confirmed 6 months later when Billy appeared on TV in high heels and stockings. I've seen some sources say that Mark left the group at the same time Durwood did, but Durwood claims that Mark was fired from the group. Tony claims that the issue with Mark was that Mark wanted to be Keith Moon when what they needed for the group was Charlie Watts, and he claimed that an early producer for the band said that eventually they would fire Mark and just kind of predicted that, which came true. Durwood and Mark sounded too heavy metal for what Generation X wanted to be. Mark and Durwood then formed a group called Empire, which wasn't commercially successful, but was actually pretty influential, especially in the emo scene of the UK. They've both been in several bands since then, and Mark retired or semi-retired from music in 2004 to form a holistic health brand. To replace Mark, they quickly brought in Terry Chimes, who was the former drummer of The Clash, but they struggled to find a new guitarist. They also were in a little bit of legal trouble with their old manager. They owed him something like £10,000, so they found a new manager. But apparently that manager was mostly interested in Billy as a solo act. Eventually, they went back to that old Chelsea well and took James Stevenson as the new guitarist, but at this point, the band was kind of just a rotating guest guitarist spot. They didn't have like a more permanent person. Other people would come in and play on different recordings and stuff. Realizing that they were going in a new direction, they thought it made sense to change their name, so they became Gen X. With this new lineup, they released Kiss Me Deadly in 1981, an album that was way more new wave pop than traditional punk, leaned more into that kind of dance music craze. That album also fell very flat, and that proved to be the last straw for the group. As Billy recalled, I suppose our new direction was mystifying to a lot of people, as the album was of quite a different nature than Valley of the Dolls. They even came up with a desperate idea to merge Gen X with some of the former Sex Pistols to create a punk supergroup, but Tony described that as more of a wouldn't it be fun kind of project that they all knew wouldn't actually work. Apparently, the split wasn't very amicable, with someone from Tony James' camp leaking to Enemy that the reason for the split was a chemical imbalance, and that was most likely a reference to Billy's increasing and worrying heroin addiction. Tony wrote, "Sadly, Billy and I could not agree on the merits of dangerous drugs as a passport to credibility. I have seen too many times that heroin destroys everything that gets in its path, from work to friendships to lives. In this case, it left me and Billy on two different planets." And just like that, the band was done. The new manager that Tony hired to save the band took Billy to New York, where they started his very successful solo career. And that was the point where Tony hadn't heard from Billy for over a year until Billy called him up and played him White Wedding. And Tony realized, I got a lot of work to do if I want to catch up to my former bandmate. So Tony started his own projects, and of course, they've both been around music ever since then. So that's the story of Generation X. They're a band that I think had so much potential, could have done so many cool things, and just never quite pieced it together. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you're a fan of Generation X, if you knew who they were, if you have any favorite memories with them, any favorite songs, and like the video if you liked it. Subscribe if you want to join me as I learn more about music history. And again, huge special thanks to all of our members. It's really cool that you want to partner with this and want to be a part of this. I really appreciate that.